Good morning.
Good morning.
I came across this verse. It was written by Shantideva 1,200 years ago. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain and dispel the miseries of the world.
Huh.
This is from a collection of verses that Shantideva wrote, which ultimately became known as the Way of the Bodhisattva. And this particular verse is one that reportedly the Dalai Lama recites to himself several times a day. I remember many years ago when I was at Brandeis University. I had a very good friend that helped me in a variety of different ways. His name was Rabbi Axelrad. He was the campus rabbi, and since I was this rube from Oklahoma, that one of my best friends in high school was a Jew, but my knowledge of conservative Judaism, for example, was extremely limited, and the university and all of its munificence appointed me to deal with a number of situations on the campus that had to do with Jewish students involved amongst themselves. The most acrimonious situations that arose between students on that campus was between conservative students and reform students. And so I had frequent occasion to go in and talk to Dr. Axelrad about what was going on and why this was happening and everything. And he said, one time he said to me something that I've never forgotten that I think is extremely interesting. He said, first you have to understand that Israel had just gone through the Six-Day War in 1967, and then it was about to go through the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And he said, what many people don't realize about the state of Israel, that it is filled with very reactionary factions and sects of Judaism, which, if it did not have a common enemy, would have blown the state of Israel apart many years ago. He said, in fact, that is one of the reasons why it is so difficult to reach any kind of a peace agreement between the Jews and the Arabs. Because there are some Jews who hate other Jews more than they hate the Arabs. But the Arabs are the same way. I mean, this is not a one-directional street here. The Arabs are exactly the same way, and so both sides are using this animosity to hold their own societies together. So, and you know, that was what, 45 years ago or something like that. And I would have to say that he was right, because I don't think that there has been any kind of progress made in that regard at all. And, you know, that is, I don't think that that is unknown in other parts of the world. Because for many, many years, I think the Cold War held this country together to some degree. And that in 1989, when the Soviet Union became bankrupt, we were sort of lost. We no longer had this common enemy, this overreaching enemy outside our boundaries that we could point at. Fortunately, we were saved.
By Ronald Reagan.
No, by 9/11.
Oh.
Yep,
I mean, I'm sorry to put it that way,
it's true.
but basically we regained our common enemy in the form of the terrorists. And that has proven to be very fruitful in terms of having an exterior enemy. And here in recent weeks, that has been rejuvenated by the call to go and deal with this faction in Iraq and Syria that has committed a number of atrocious acts. And so once again, we find ourselves committed to a state of war. It pains me to think of how warlike this culture has become. And it has even begun to affect the streets that we drive on and the sidewalks we walk on, with all the problems that we're now encountering with police forces who have been militarized. Evil is commonly regarded as something outside of ourselves. It is either considered a kind of substance that lurks around and may contaminate us from time to time. We very often talk about it in terms of the manifestation of various archetypes in religion, like Satan. We also talk about evil as being an inherent characteristic of certain people. In any event, we talk about it as if it were something separate from ourselves. And it allows us to demonize other people in other countries. And it works at all different levels. I read a book a few years ago that was talking about the Israeli-Arab conflict, and its focus was on the way in which both societies, both the Palestinians, the Arabs, as well as the Israelis, demonized the other. They turned the other into this inherently evil society filled with evil people who were ruthless and remorseless. And when you do that, you can then do the types of things that have just occurred in the Gaza Strip, because those are not people any longer. Those are animals that we need to exterminate in some sense. I would have to say that more evil has been done in the name of ridding ourselves of evil than any other thing. And you know, this is something I think that has been true throughout history. You know, Adolf Hitler honestly believed, I think, that he was ridding the world of evil when he built his concentration camps, and when he transported all those Jews and gypsies and gay people and everybody else that ended up in those camps. Stalin thought that he was doing good when he wiped out the majority of the agrarian class in Russia, because he wanted to replace those people with a collective, with a communist collective. And he didn't believe that he would be able to do that if he allowed the remnants of serfdom to continue to exist. The United States thought that we were ridding the world of evil when we invaded Iraq and created a perfect mess. But it doesn't only operate, you know, at the level of countries and on an international scale. We do this within our communities. You know, there are certain people that are considered evil. It's the Hatfields and the McCoys, you see. You know? I mean, here in Santa Fe, we have a lot of Espanola jokes, right? Well, that's another way of doing it. That's not nearly as bad as pulling out a gun, but it might pave the way to doing that. The thing about it is that, you know, if we see other people as evil, as hurtful, then we allow ourselves to hurt them.
That's one of the things that's really bothering me is Alan Way's commercial. And he talks about the dangerous illegals coming across our border.
Yes, that's right.
The first, when you start referring to people as illegals, and that's the first step towards denying that they're human.
Well, it happens at, you know, at all levels, and it also happens within Sanghas. You know, there's a really good, I think, explanation for all of this. As David Loy has pointed out, you know, our concept of self is really sort of a psychological figment of our imagination. And having an external enemy, particularly a collective enemy, gives some substance to our sense of self. And we feel good about ourselves. You know, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the very next day, recruiting offices were filled with young men who wanted to go and fight the Japanese. That was very important to them. I think it really gave them a sense of purpose. It gave them a sense of self. It gave them an identity that they could, quote, rely upon, unquote. This also even works with people who are trying to help other people. You know, being compassionate, manifesting compassion, cannot be held as identical to social justice. You know, when we want to help the immigrants, or if we want to help the poor, or the sick in this country, or any disadvantaged minority, if we do that to the exclusion of extending our compassion to the other side of the koan, or the koan, right, the coin, you know, we're making a big mistake. And we are being just as blind as all these other people who are demonizing each other. I'm going to read you something from Thich Nhat Hanh.
You could say that was the beauty of Nelson Mandela. He was a great example of that.
That's right. You're absolutely right. He was the guy that transcended that.
Yeah.
And I think it made all the difference in the world, especially in South Africa in that society. Now, it may have slipped a little bit back the other way in recent times, but here's a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh. In Latin America, liberation theologians speak of God's preference or option for the poor, the oppressed, and the marginalized. But I do not think God wants us to take sides, even with the poor. The rich also suffer, in many cases more than the poor. They may be rich materially, but many are poor spiritually, and they suffer a lot. I have known rich and famous people who have ended up committing suicide. I am certain that those with the highest understanding will be able to see the suffering in both the poor and the rich. You know, that is an extremely difficult place to get to. You know, I was thinking about this with respect to Obama, and I was wondering whether he really appreciates this in this way. Because the real problem with ISIS is not the fact that they are ruthless and without remorse. We also need to consider what are the conditions that brought all this about. And we certainly have to look at ourselves very closely and assess what we contributed to this problem. This kind, you know, this is called reconciliation. And it is so very important. When people find reconciliation impossible to achieve, we have a war, or some sort of a fight. And it's a matter of an everyday occurrence. Right now, there are many factions, social, economic, political factions in this country that are irreconcilable for reasons that I'm not really sure about. I would like to think more about that and try to understand that, because that's the only way that you're going to bring about a reconciliation. You know, Cindo was talking about immigration. I see immigration as a problem of purity. Every culture in the world has a standard of purity. It is probably most prominent in the Middle East. But it's also prominent here, and you can see the difference in the political parties. Republicans, by and large, are very concerned about purity, about making sure that only the right people get access to the right things at the right time for the right reasons. Other people are less concerned with that aspect of it, but may be more concerned with something else that is somewhat problematic. So it's important to understand that these people who oppose these children on the border, they also need to be understood. They also need to be reconciled. And you cannot do that by going directly at them. I think that, well, I'm not sure how you're going to solve that problem, but there really needs to be an effort made to not only address the needs of the so-called needy, but also the needs of those people who are opposed to the needy, or opposed to doing anything for the needy. But one of the first things you have to do is you have to change your impulse to demonize the opposition. That's really the first important step. The second step is to understand that what we call evil is really rooted in the three poisons, which is greed, anger, and above all, ignorance. And it's not just the ignorance on the other side of the border, it's our ignorance. Specifically, your ignorance, my ignorance. See? There's a Thich Nhat Hanh has a lot to say on this subject, and this is the book that I quoted here is Living Buddha, Living Christ, which is an attempt to reconcile Buddhism with Christianity, and it's a very good book. I recommend it. You take a look at it. He also said, if we align ourselves with one side or the other, we will lose our chance to work for peace. Reconciliation is to understand both sides. Now, Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a book, published a book of poetry several years ago, and I think it's a sutra book. It's called Call Me By My True Names. You can get it on your Kindle. It's really worth reading because it covers it covers all the main points of this practice rather well. And this is what he said. This is part of a poem that is entitled, Please Call Me By My True Names. I'm the 12-year-old girl, refugee on a small boat, who throws herself into the ocean after being raped by a sea pirate. And I'm the pirate, my heart not yet capable of seeing and loving. Thanks.